So for the bulk of my career at Google, I was working with luxury and fashion, first in media, then strategy, then creative. And the first place that we started to see that luxury brands needed to align with sports was over a decade ago. My example of this is when the NBA created a dress code in the mid 2000s, and you saw the evolution in the way that the NBA players were dressing, and they became almost these de facto models for all of these brands. And I remember in one of my first meetings with I was on the LVMH account with their agency, they started commenting about how the NBA players walking from the car to the locker room before the game was sort of a quasi runway. Sure. Now, people have been talking about that a lot recently, but I always remember that inflection point when people were thinking like, hey, there's a big audience here. And not surprisingly, it also aligned with the rise of kind of streetwear, hip hop culture aligning with fashion and sport at the same time, which made it a much richer opportunity for brands.
So that was that tipping point there. Now, you obviously continued these conversations with luxury goods brands over the years. What are some of the common rebuttals or kind of pushback that you would get from brands that, you'd approach with these ideas around sport?
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing you always come back to is that our audience that buys our product isn't there. And that was, I thought it was foolish at the time, but it was also really short-sighted, because what you saw was with both sports and music is that the things that their customers were most interested in those categories was changing. So I think that, for sports, for instance, like you would often see like in the World Cup, like Hublot, like sponsoring the clock or what have you. But the fact of the matter is the World Cup is every 4 years, and that there was a lot of other bigger sporting events that are happening on a year-to-year basis. And the thing that was really telling was when you could show that that top 20% household income that luxury brands are looking for is like, they're watching NBA, they're listening to hip hop music, they're doing all of the things that you maybe 10 years ago would say, oh, that our audience isn't there. So the biggest piece of it was that your audience is here, but you're not. And, that begins the conversation, when we started working with, say, Hennessy, who's been a big NBA partner for the past, 10, 15 years, is like, not only do you need to align with sports in the right way, but also in the way that your consumers are engaging with it. So for those brands that were ahead of the curve, aligning with the live event is not enough. You have to remember about not only are consumers engaging with sports, but they're engaging with sports differently than maybe me and you would have growing up, where the game happens live, which is great, but a lot of times the conversation's happening on social. You're watching full game highlights on YouTube. You're engaging with sports in a much different way. It's really interesting when I talk to young people about how they watch sports.
Yeah.
It's less tuning in at 7:30 to watch the game. It's watching, the 9-minute recapper on YouTube. Totally. It's seeing the highlight videos on TikTok. It's seeing what, Shaq and Charles Barkley said about the game.
Yeah.
It's a different experience, and it's not good or bad. It's just, and it also represents a different opportunity for brands, in that it's not enough to have the 30 that plays during the game. You need to have ways to activate, around all of those different type of placements where people are engaging.
For sure, and ongoing. And so was some of this wrapped up in like a resistance to the fragmentation of media as well? Like, I know that early on, like luxury goods advertisers were a little bit resistant to, getting a little too social, being on social media, that kind of thing.
As we're talking now too, I think there was another resistance. It wasn't that they were concerned that their audience wasn't there. It was also brand adjacency. So the thinking is like, the September issue of Vogue was always a big deal because it was your brand was there, but also all the other luxury brands are there. When you think about aligning with sports, you're going to be next to more mass brands.
Sure.
The thing that I think really helps brands feel more comfortable about that is like all of fashion, all of luxury right now is about high-low. So, when you think about it in the fashion space, you may have your Chanel handbag, but you could be wearing it with something from Zara. Yep. And so the thinking of consumers that way of being, multidimensional and saying, some stuff I want to go high on, but other pieces I want to go low.
It's like Hennessy and Budweiser.
That 100%, and that's the piece of it is like, those are two drinks that they're different, but I'll have both. Like, depending
Totally.
on depending on what the situation is. So
Yep.
I think that's another piece of it, is like it represented, as brands have been more comfortable with aligning with sports, it represents a shift in understanding their consumer better, in that just because we're next to these other brands which are super high quality, it doesn't mean we're devaluing what we're saying.
Yeah. So there was an Olympic spot that we discussed from Lululemon. We chatted about it recently. What about this spot intrigued you?
Well, the main piece about it was the structure of the spot. So it opened quick and it did all of the things that we know about effective advertising in 2023, which, when it comes to narrative structure, visual language, all of those pieces. Two things popped out to me. One was that the great thing about sports is, I played basketball in college, and like one of the things that I always kind of think back, knowing that it was a long time ago now, is that you connected with people that you wouldn't have if you didn't play. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting when you watch the Team Canada spot, or when you just think about the Olympics in general, is that every 4 years you're learning about sports you've never heard of, you're learning about athletes you've never heard of, and there's always some breakout star in some, not random, but like lesser known sport that becomes some big star. And a lot of times, like, it almost speaks to this idea that sports is just a huge opportunity to tell more stories, to tell more inclusive stories. Totally. You see the ad, the Lululemon spot, it's like you have all different types of people in there that are all excellent in their chosen sport. And I think that's really exciting. The other piece of it is you get a layer of authenticity. So if you see this story, it's like, these are real athletes that are super talented, that are able to do things in their profession that most people can only dream of. And that's always interesting to learn about those folks, no matter what event it is or what have you. And I think that's really exciting. Now, the other piece that I'll mention about the spot, and what I think is really interesting going forward, is that in the execution of it, is that the best ads that are going to align with sports in the luxury category, they're going to think about the visual, but also the audio just as much. So if you watch that Lululemon spot, the audio cues that actually bring people further into the story are really, really prevalent throughout. And I think that's the idea of ambient attention. So think about, I don't know how people are going to be watching the Olympics, but all I know is, I'll speak from personal experience, is that a lot of times when I'm watching sports, I'm a big NBA guy, like, the game's on in the background. And, when it comes fourth quarter time, then you're locked in or whatever. But if you think about the game being on in the background, what does it mean? You're listening. So if your ad needs to grab attention, you think about the viewer kind of having that ambient attention on whatever, is playing. The audio is going to be a way to bring people back into the story. So I think you're going to see that a lot with the most effective ads that align with sports, is that the visual will be, just what we would expect from luxury brands. They do art better than anybody, but the audio design and the sonic cues that are going to accompany that story are going to be just as important and just as kind of meaningful and intentional when they craft these stories.
That's an amazing insight. And are you seeing more luxury brands now, like, really investing in their sonic assets?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways to think about sonic assets. So one is sonic branding. So this is not luxury McDonald's, but that's an automatic cue. Like Intel has a great one. Absolutely. But I think it's also about, in your storytelling, you're thinking about how audio adds texture. So even, I worked on YouTube for almost a decade, and one of our things that we talked about a lot was, 95% sound on. Ads on YouTube are watched with the sound on 95% of the time, which is great. That was always a differentiator versus social platforms. But what we're seeing now, as all of these platforms continue to pivot to video, is that they're making audio a bigger part of the conversation. And when we think about audio, you're not just thinking music. Now, luxury brands do music really well. Music's great, obviously, like, it can be a really key part of the storytelling, but we're thinking about sonic, sound effects, the script, what words are you saying? What is the voiceover? Many times, if you're telling a really emotional story, you're creating a world, but the world becomes much richer and textured when you can actually hear what's going on there. So I think it's a really great way to communicate quality. I read a great piece. It's an older piece. I think it probably came in 2019, but it was in Wired, and it was about how specific luxury brands, when they're making their products, they're thinking about the kind of tangible sounds and like feedback from like a haptic standpoint that they're getting when you experience the products. And audio in the ad is a way to communicate that quality. I think about it in cars where you unlock the door or whatever, that sound it really communicates a higher level of quality. And that is the thing that's exciting about that for me as a creative person, is like, these are things that you can adjust if you see that it's not working. Yep. If you're running an ad and something's not working, like an easy-ish place to address that is in the audio.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can always do stuff in post-production when it comes to audio. Now, the long-term vision is to have, when you write the brief, is that you're thinking audio just as heavy as the visual part of it.
For sure. It can really frame the way the feelings are evoked. Right. I've used this example, with clients before, like the one of the stars of Home Alone is the score.
Absolutely.
Right? Like one of my favorite.
Well, we're going to talk about this brand at some point, but when Coach did their Coach TV spots from 2022, which was, a campaign that I worked on, or 2021, excuse me, they did Coach Alone, which was a parody and homage to Home Alone. But the most important part of that was
Cool.
Like like, and you can't, the story doesn't work without that, without the audio component of it.
100%. So back to sport. LVMH recently announced their Olympic sponsorships. Do you see this as a one-off because it's in their hometown of Paris, or the start of something perhaps more long-term?
Start of something long-term. This is a perfect, in my opinion, like LVMH, I worked with them a long time, and then I've been a fan since leaving that business. They are always looking for new ways to connect with consumers. And I think this was the perfect alignment because it was in Paris. But when you think about their brand, the best part about LVMH is the diversity of products. Like, you have fashion, couture, but you have jewelry, you have beauty, you have champagne, you have any sort of things that, and I think, I was thinking about it for the Olympics. It's like, okay, fashion for the uniforms, jewelry for the medals, and then champagne to celebrate. They can really engage in many different ways throughout the event. And I think obviously they're going to make a decision based upon what their ROI is from this sponsorship. But as there's just more, it's more limited in finding places to connect on a mass level, like where everybody's engaged. Sports, I think this, like, sports is still an opportunity for like live, for everybody tuning in at once. It's harder to even do that with award shows now. So I think too, like, sports still represents a place where you can, where people are doing it all together.
Yeah.
And so they'll judge it based upon what happens with the Olympics. But they just re-signed a deal for the America's Cup, which is obviously sailing and more niche. But I just see it as one of the best places to connect on, sort of, not to use the, overuse this word, but like kind of connect to the cultural zeitgeist, when whether it be the Super Bowl, NBA, Olympics, whatever, like these are things that are happening at a specific moment that everybody is kind of following.
Well, it's also in LA in 2028 too, right? Like there's that piece that's come, the Summer Olympics coming 4 years later in LA. So there's an opportunity there to kind of obviously connect with the celebrity cachet of Hollywood once again. So look, if you were providing some advice right now to luxury brands that are still maybe on the fence, or maybe not necessarily, all in on sport, what would you say? What would be your kind of key 3 to 5 things that they need to be considering?
I think just don't go all in. Just try stuff little by little. You know, when I worked with Hennessy, we didn't change their creative. We just simply aligned their media to more of an NBA, to more of an NBA sponsorship when it came to digital. So think about the things that you can do in the short term that will give you clues on whether you want to go further with it. You know, if you have, you know, your same style of storytelling, but you're aligning it to a more sports audience and it's working, the consumers are telling you something and it's time to go further. So I would say approach it with an experimentation is the best practice, and that, you know, that's the great part about the advertising world that we live in now, is that you don't have to make a decision in concrete. You know, you can evolve it as you see the performance. So I would say to just start to dabble in it in ways that your brand can do so in a way that's efficient, that's, you know, cost effective, all of those things. But just to get started, I would say the media alignment is the easiest piece of that. You know, no matter what platform you're heavily invested on, there's always a way to align with sports or a specific sport. Perhaps that's the best way to do so, is like, instead of going with sports general, maybe align with exactly the specific sport that your audience is most interested in. Again, you know, no matter what platform you're invested in, there's ways to gather insights that'll tell you, you know, who is most going to be heavily interested in your brand, and you can align to that specific sport. So I would say that's the main thing, is that approach it with the experimentation first mindset. And then also I would say be open to being surprised. You know, whenever you're doing something new, whether it's aligning with sports or something else, the hesitation is to look for things as to why it's not working, because, you know, a lot of times folks that have been at the brand or worked on the brand for a long time, they have an understanding of what's come before. But a lot of times, you know, when approaching something new, like, that's the best part, is that you have the opportunity to be surprised on the performance. So I would say also go into it with not just an experimentation is the best practice mindset, but with a mindset that you're going to learn something as much as everybody else.
Awesome. As always, man, amazing to hear your perspective on all of this. And you know, do you want to do a plug?
Yeah, man, I would say that it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 6 months. But over at JMA, we are heavily invested in understanding the right alignment between luxury and sport. Me and you have been working on a thought piece as it relates to this. So there's always stuff that we can offer together as well, utilizing BrainSights data. But yeah, don't anybody who's interested, don't be hesitant to reach out, because we have a lot to offer when it comes to this topic, both on luxury, but also how to relate to sport and align with sport in a richer and more effective way.